I keep hearing this argument from Republicans that we are spending too much money on Ukraine and it should go to the American people. I completely disagree that it is too much money, and I argue that it is actually going to the benefit of the American people, and therefore this is a bullshit argument used to attempt to convince people that, sure, Republicans care about Ukraine, but they actually care about Americans more, so vote for Republicans. In reality, it's more like they don't care about Ukraine and want to watch Biden squirm and fail on the global stage so they can score political points when the elections come and say, we wouldn't have let Ukraine fail, we wouldn't have had the war in the first place. Here is why I believe it's not about money. And don't worry, I'll do one on the border because that's another BS argument, but that's another video and I'm using spending on this one. The chart you see in front of you is the percentage of gross domestic product that has gone to national defense in the United States since 1930. Now, as you can see, it was relatively low before, obviously, a major jump for World War II. I mean, it was huge, 43%, but that was obviously a world war and the spending was enormous. We see another small jump when it comes to the Korean War, and then an even smaller jump when it comes to Vietnam. During Vietnam, we were spending 11% of our GDP on defense. However, since World War II, there has been a general downward trend in total defense spending as a percent of gross domestic product to the point where here in 2022, it's only 3.6%. The last time it was this low was in 1940, before World War II. So we're actually spending less as a percent of our total GDP on national defense than we have since before World War II. From 1950s roughly to 1991, outside of Vietnam and Korea, the primary reason our defense budget existed was to counter the Soviet threat. In 2022, there are three primary uses for our defense budget. The first of which is apparently still countering a belligerent Russia. The second is potentially countering China. And the third is continuing to prosecute the global war on terror, even though that chunk is shrinking. 3.6% of our total expenditures goes towards countering those three threats. And in those threats, Russia. Russia has been the consistent threat throughout this entire time period, even though in the 90s they were relatively weak due to their collapse of the Soviet Union. At a time when spending was as much as 7% of our GDP in the 1980s, as much as 5% of our GDP in the 1990s, we didn't really face a threat from the Soviet Union at that point either, but we were still spending way more than we spend now. Today, it's only 3.6%. But for some reason, even though we're spending far less, we have decided that we don't want to counter the Russian threat and aggression anymore because it costs too much relative to what? The history? Because it certainly doesn't. It certainly didn't cost too much when it actually did cost more as a percentage of our GDP throughout history. When you drill further down into the numbers, you realize that the amount we would be sending to Ukraine is even less. We're talking about 0.3% of our GDP. So at this moment, we are seeking to spend 0.3 of our annual, not like a 10-year GDP, just our 1-year GDP to block Russia in Ukraine, to see Russia defeated and set back decades. Again, a large chunk of our current military budget is aimed at doing just that. But now when the chips are down on actually doing that, countering Russia, Republicans get cold feet. And it's really not about cold feet, though, as I said before, because they never used to get cold feet. Reagan would have cheered such an opportunity to defeat Russia for the cost of 0 lives and less than 1% of our GDP. Give me a break. He would be all over that. So when spending comes up, I call bullshit because every Republican president that came before has spent more on national defense, including Trump. And the aim there was countering, for the most part, was countering the Soviet/Russia threat. But now, suddenly it's a problem. Yeah, sure it is.